Hi, good afternoon. This is Meredith Lego, and I'm doing a series of videos on Ascension science. Most of the content that I am providing has come through channeling and a being who is an ascended master called Ascended Master Hilarion. So he's basically an ascended master because he's moved beyond the need for reincarnation, and I'm connected with him to understand various learnings or wisdoms on how it is that we do that. And every being, if you will, out there in the universe goes through this process. So he's basically sharing this with me. In the last couple of videos, we've talked about the stages of ascension. And prior to that, he has provided wisdoms that sort of build upon various lessons. And if you haven't watched them so far, I highly encourage you to go back to the beginning. But it's built upon the concepts of the quantum field, mirroring, polarity, and just various other topics. So in the last video, I touched upon the third stage of ascension, excuse me, which is basically the process of starting to let go of the ego personality construct and gain more mastery over the mental body. So again, you're gaining more mastery over the ego personality construct and essentially starting to let that go. Shortly after I channeled this particular session with him, I was prompted to awaken at about 4:30 in the morning, and he downloaded to me a pretty powerful channeling, which actually is my favorite of all the ones that I've received for him. But it was on the concept of letting go, because this is the stage that essentially I'm at, which is learning to let go of the ego personality and how that happens. So I wanted to share it with you. So he starts by saying that the flow of energy is a powerful thing. When it starts, it swells up in your body from the base and rises up the spine in a wave-like pattern through the top of the head. This life force energy is the chi prana, or source energy, dwelling within the field that, combined with the heart center, fuses together the calling from source, or God if you wish to call it, to give guidance to the individual. It matters not what you call it. These are the subtle influences, pulses, or messages from the higher self to the being in physical manifestation with direction of what the higher self or source energy wishes to experience. So essentially, we are in a quantum field, and we've got different points within our body through the chakra systems in which we can process information and energy from the quantum field into and out of our multidimensional bodies. And what he's saying is that essentially you've got chi or prana energy that's kind of flowing up through the base of the spine and is giving you subtle information that is coming through source energy, but with intentions that can be very much directed from your higher self. And if you go back to some of the previous videos I've done, the best way to tune into what your higher self really is trying to communicate to you is to really listen to the subtle influences, the feelings that you have, and sometimes it's a knowingness. But essentially that's the best way that the higher self communicates and tries to get it through to you. He goes on to say that despite these impulses, the being still has free will to override the desire. This, in most cases, is not an intentional override, for the being is really not attuned to the subtle calling from source. If the being is awakened and attuned, there can be an intentional choice which most often occurs in the beginning phases of the Ascension Phase 3, when the being is learning to integrate the light and the dark. The process of balancing light and dark is not easy. It can be unsettling to let go of beliefs, prejudices, and learnings of the lifetime. The calling to let go is not easy, for it takes total control out of the hand of the being and puts the steering of the ship into the captainship of the higher self. Often most beings have allowed the ego to be in charge, and this has been the case for many thousands of years due to the forgetting process. The being gives up from the mind. So essentially, what he's saying in this last paragraph is that essentially when you're going through the phases of ascension, especially phase 2, phase 3, your consciousness and your mind starts to exert more control. But at the same time, you start to be more influenced, or let's say triggered, by various energies that you're living in, and you can start to see them as polarized set of energies. So for example, different things that are going on in your life will have different vibrational frequencies, and you will experience or think about them as either good or bad, or hot or cold. Again, we chose to be in this environment because it's through those polarity experiences and vibrational frequencies that we have the opportunity to learn. Because, for example, you can't understand hot if you don't also understand what cold is. But, essentially, many of the things that we go through, and especially in our world today, I'm sure you might experience the fact that we live in more of a polarized world than possibly in the past. But essentially, when we start to, see it for what it is, you start to let go of beliefs, prejudices, and learnings that you've had growing up. And some of it can be from this lifetime, some of it can be past lifetimes. But essentially what you're starting to do is let that go. And as opposed to listening to your ego saying, oh, this, you should believe this, and you should go down this direction or think this thing, that's because, I'm the ego. I'm doing some things to help you stay in control of your situation. You're essentially starting to let go and listen to your feelings, which might be different than necessarily what you have always been led to believe. He goes on to say that with the flow of energy comes a start of peace. For often, when the ego learns to let go, the higher self will always align with one's true passion and joy. In fact, the subtle feeling of passion and joy is a message from the higher self or source energy of the direction the being should pursue on earth. So the letting go is very simple in reality. Simply follow the impulses that make you happy. Why then is there so much resistance to doing that? Often it is fear and the ego personality. The ego personality does not want to give up captainship of the vehicle, and so it spins or whips up a number of rationalities in the mind as to why the being should not pursue the calling to joy. It could be a fear-based thought, but most often it is more of a rationalization of why the being shouldn't do it, such as, I'm too tired, or I'll do it tomorrow, or it'll take too much effort, or I don't have the skills. For this particular paragraph, I see that I'm currently in this kind of phase of ascension, if you will, because I'm in the point of, I'll sense an impulse coming in from the higher self in terms of something that I know is going to make me happy. And then I find my ego or personality basically having a conversation saying, no, you shouldn't go down that path. And that's where the rational mind starts to come in and sort of talk yourself out of it. And I now that I'm understanding this whole process, I can spot it when it's happening. And, I am starting to pick up to all of the rationalities that the mind puts into place of why not to do something that, basically is coming up through my feelings. So it's definitely an interesting process that I'm going through. Hopefully by hearing this, you'll be able to start observing this in yourself. He goes on to say that deep down, all rationalizations come from a place of fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being judged, and fear of not being loved. During the phase of listening to the calling of the higher self, the being goes through a dark night of the soul in which the being lets go of those fears as realization grabs hold for self-love. You can call it extreme self-confidence. Doing something, being who you are, and living in all of your glory regardless of what others think or perceive. For a being with self-love truly can conquer the world. In the sense that the universe will provide a life of happiness towards the destination of joy and bliss. In some rare cases these days, the impulse might lead to experience a lesson which most would deem less than desirable, such as killing or a horrible crime. In most cases, the higher self or source contracted to experience that event, either to assume an archetype, clear karma, or create karma for a lesson. Experiencing the lessons is a part of growth that one needs to connect back with source. For it is through those experiences that the individual soul and source learns that love really is the most optimal way. Once the being fully merges with the higher self, she already understands that all form, physical and energetic, is source. The being has no desire to commit an act of hate, judgment, or violence against any other being. So that it seems pretty simple enough. So basically, what he's saying is follow what brings you the biggest joy and happiness, because essentially you're creating a vibrational frequency within yourself that is actually going to start, manifesting out into the field, and it's a self-fulfilling, self-repeating process. So if you go back to the last videos that I did on the whole concept of the field and how you can start to manifest in the field using your vibrational frequencies, or how that essentially happens, you essentially can create a more positive timeline for yourself going forward. But what's interesting here is that he says when you start to let go of the ego personality construct and do not allow the fear that's kind of popping up with, oh, you shouldn't do this because this will happen, or you shouldn't do this because this will happen. Usually it can be, and he's right, because I see it within myself, this ties to a certain under at the very base, it's based upon a fear of some sort. He mentions abandonment, judgment, or not being loved. So essentially, if you go through letting that go, which can be a hard thing to do, because that might be, for example, leaving a job, or possibly walking away from a partner, or walking away from a friendship. So you have to get past that fear of the fact that, gee, if I do this, something bad's going to happen over there, and essentially follow more of your joy and your passion, whatever feelings are dwelling up inside of you. And essentially that's called self-love, because you're learning to love what your feelings are and what your higher self is telling you, more than the fear that's gripping you from keeping to move forward. He also basically said that, if you kind of go back through the paragraph, sometimes these impulses that come in through the higher self can lead to sort of negative acts, which in some cases, might be sort of a situation playing out that source, deems to be necessary. Not that killing's necessarily a bad thing, but this could be an individual where the light is sort of more blocked, but essentially the soul might have to go through this experience in order to essentially move past it in the future. Then I essentially ask, can you say more about how to let go? Because right now, this is the point I am in my soul's evolution, where I'm trying to figure out how to let go, because I'm a bit of a control freak growing up, where I've always wanted to kind of control my situation and my surrounding. So for somebody like me, the idea of letting go is more of a challenge. So he says, All inhibitions of the soul are often the direct conflict or violation of the ego personality's will. Letting go can be a difficult process because all the fears of the ego come pouring out of the cup, and the being must face them head on. So, to let go is to face your fears, like facing a bully in a dark alley. Facing fears will always bring or result in change in life, a drastic shift, and the being fears the uncertainty or pain of going through the shift and not knowing what will change on the other side. Letting go is very hard for a controlling type A personality. The transition usually may not take that long, equivalent to a long crying for a forest fire. But when the dust settles and the smoke clears, new growth emerges. The higher self or source will call into life of the being that which is really desired, that which will bring more joy and bliss than was experienced before. So how to do this? Come to an inner peace and place of knowing that the other side will bring more joy than the now. Come to a knowing that any transition will be temporary. It will pass. The smoke will clear, and the other side will bring a ray of sun. Trust is needed. Blind trust. So obviously, this is difficult if you are, always trying to control your environment because you don't necessarily want to take chances or risks or what's going to happen on the other side. He goes on to say that form in your mind that which brings joy and happiness, and then let go with the flow each day and in each moment. Don't make it more complex than it needs to be. Simply do what brings you, what makes you happy or feels right in each moment. That is bringing you towards that which you desire or envision. For example, writing a book doesn't have to be an overly complex process. Just sit down and write a little every day. Allow the words to flow from you, flow from source within you. No thinking or pressure required, just a little dedicated time. This is the power of creation and precipitation. Creation can occur through will, following the heart, and having a rhythm of time each day to create. Like setting a time to exercise each day or to eat each day. Find a time to do what makes you happy for bigger projects and follow the most obvious impulse of what you think you should do for each now moment in your day. Don't overthink it, just follow the impulses. That's all for now. Peace be with you, Chela. So, based upon where I am on my kind of soul's journey, this was an extremely important lesson for me to hear, the entire process of just learning to let go. And since I received this particular teaching back in the middle of 2020, I work on it every single day, and I really try and work on, when I have an impulse and I automatically have a reaction of not wanting to go down that path where my mind's starting to rationalize something, at least I'm attuned to the fact that that's happening, so I can work on overcoming whatever fears might be coming to the surface and try and meditate on what that might have actually come from, like what was the trigger of that fear, so that I could work on overcoming that, because it could be sort of a fear of not manifesting, or a fear of abandonment, or a fear of just not being loved. So that was a great lesson, and in fact my favorite. So I was happy to share this with you. And with that, we'll continue moving on in the stages of Ascension in future videos, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, bye.